Hello, welcome to Huminact. Welcome back for even more brilliant training tips that you can take and use in your own crew resource management or human factors training. Today, we're going to be talking more specifically about the topic standard operating procedures. I'll give you an example of a small but simple and effective activity that you can use to help you underline the importance of following SOPs and particularly so standard phraseology. But it's also useful to help underline what might happen if we don't use standard phraseology. Now, as always, I will of course take you through every single step on the way, from the questions I ask to what I put on the flip chart, and of course also how to conduct the activity and what to get out of it. Let's start with the first question I usually ask my students. And that is, in the past year, how often have you yourself witnessed an SOP not being followed? And I provide the following 5 options for their answers. I suggest you give people a minute or two to think about this before you facilitate their answers. Then just go through the classroom one by one, asking people what they've answered, and make a mark for their answers on the flip chart like this. Now, their answers, of course, may depend on the operational environment that you're in, the company culture, and of course also on how honest do they actually dare to be with you as a trainer. However, generally speaking, what you're likely to get is something that looks more or less like this. The obvious next question to ask our students would be, so what are the types of SOPs that you witnessed not being followed? Now, I've done this exercise many times in many different companies myself, and the usual top 3 of procedures not being followed I get are these. And as a trainer, ideally what you're looking for is for someone to mention standard phraseology or standard callouts, because you're going to be using these later. So if that's not what you get from your students, you can ask them, how about standard phraseology or callouts? Put that on the flip chart as well. Now, before you move on, I suggest you spend a bit of time at this point perhaps asking people how big a problem do they think these breaches are. How important is it that we use the exact phraseology, and why doesn't it always happen? You are likely to perhaps hear some people insisting that overly focusing on standard phraseology and using the correct words is a complete waste of time. Some I've even come across call it anal. Now, if you get comments such as these, take a mental note of them because you are going to return to them later. But at this stage, just listen without revealing your thoughts and thank people for their input. What I also suggest you do at this time is perhaps generate a brief talk about general adherence to SOPs and also what are the risks associated with moving outside of the SOP framework. What I do is usually divide my classroom in the middle into 2 halves. I then turn to one half and ask them to discuss what are the benefits of following an SOP. I then turn to the other half and ask them to discuss what are the possible risks associated with not following an SOP. When you sense that your students have finished working on this, put down their pens, you turn to this side of the classroom and ask people. So what were the benefits you came up with of following an SOP? And you want to list these on the flip chart under benefit. When you've gotten all their answers, you turn to the other side of the class and ask them, so what were the potential risks you came up with associated with not following an SOP? And you put these up under risks. Now, the answers I've put on the flip chart are the usual ones I get. You might get slightly different ones yourself, but they are likely to look like this, so now you know what you can expect. Now, just tell people we will park your answers here and get back to them. What I usually do now is just show these 4 symbols on a PowerPoint slide and ask people, what are these symbols all about? People will quickly respond. They are taken from a card game. Of course, people know what this is. What I usually also ask is, would it be fair to say that these symbols are kind of a standard operating procedure, a standard phraseology throughout the world? The answer to this question is usually yes. So I tell people we're going to be using these symbols. You all know what they mean in a short activity. It is now time for you to introduce the activity to your students. All you need for this is a deck of playing cards. Now, firstly, remove the jokers from the set and pick out 3 random cards. Now tell your students, In my hand, I've got 3 randomly picked cards. I will read these out aloud, one by one, slowly. It is your job to try and remember the cards and write them down correctly on a piece of paper. Now, after I've read out all 3 cards, there'll be a short pause of 5 seconds. This pause is for you to try and get the 3 cards into your short-term memory. When the 5 seconds are up, I will call go, and you can write down what you remember. Just give your students half a minute or so to write down. When they've put down their pens, you may ask them, how many of you got all 3 cards? Now, you've probably already worked out that most people will be able to remember 3 cards, but it's going to get more difficult. Now, tell your students we're going to do one more round, but I'll double the amount of cards to 6. This will make it much more difficult for your brain to hang on to all of that information. So before we do that, let's just have a talk about tips to better remember. So you want to ask students for their tips to better remember and list them on the flip chart. Here is a slide with a few of the usual answers I get. Now, thank students for their input, but tell them, I'm sorry, but I'm not going to allow you to use all of that. That would make it too easy. However, though, what I will allow is for you to discuss whether you can agree on a structure or an order or a system that you'd like me to follow when I read out the cards. I'd be happy to do that. What I usually do while they're discussing is leave the 4 symbols up on a PowerPoint slide, and this usually gives a clue as to what they choose. So generally speaking, they will ask me to go by spades, then by hearts, then by diamonds, and then by clubs. And sometimes even in ascending order from the lowest to the highest. Whatever they choose, just make sure you follow that strategy. We're now ready to conduct round number 2 with 6 cards. Now, instead of randomly picking cards, I have chosen 6 very specific cards, and I'll show you what they are. When I read out the cards, of course, I make sure that I follow the structure or the order that people have asked me to follow. But there is something else I change. I change the standard phraseology of each card. So I might use the correct phraseology for the first 2 cards, saying 8 of spades, 7 of hearts. For the 3rd card, I might say the majesty of love, 2 of diamonds, half a dozen diamonds, and 4 pretty plants. So basically all I do is change the standard phraseology. So what can you imagine happens? Well, let me tell you. You're likely to see people sighing, rolling their eyes, putting down their pens, or giving up, taking a deep breath. And you might even hear statements such as, come on, this is impossible. You threw me off completely. Whatever the statements, just make sure that you list them on the flip chart. Now, of course, the next thing you want to do is just ask your students, how many of you managed to get all 6 cards down correctly? How many of you managed 5, 4, 3? People will probably accuse you of not following the SOP, to which you can just say, well, the SOP was that you wanted me to follow this structure, which I did. The only thing I changed is the words I use, but I thought from earlier conversations today that that wasn't a problem. So when I change the words, what does it do to your brain? And this leads you to a talk about expectations, that if we expect something and something else happens, the brain uses a lot more brain power to process that information and try to work it out. You may even go back to your list of risks of not following SOP and ask your students, how many of these can we actually tick mark? How many of these became reality to you when I changed the phraseology? And the likelihood is that they'll place a tick mark next to quite a few of them. So the point here is, why at all take the risk? Why change the phraseology if we risk that this happens to the people that we work with? Now, to me, this is a very powerful activity. It helps us to underline the importance of sticking with SOPs. But just as importantly, it gives people the experience of what happens in their brain when I just change a few words. Have fun, and remember, the exercise speaks for itself, so you don't have to raise your voice. Thank you for watching. Visit huminact.com for more training tips.